General Eisenhower died today. His death was peaceful and natural.
Two former American presidents today issued messages of condolence and tribute to the late 34th President, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
On March 28, 1969, news shook the United States and caused a small earthquake in the world of politics. At the age of 78, Dwight Eisenhower, the 34th President of the nation who had governed from 1953 to 1961, had passed away. His death was attributed to heart failure, although his health problems dated back to the 1950s. He had always been a compulsive smoker, and despite attempts to quit, his heart was already showing signs of failure. In 1955, he had suffered a heart attack, and although he recovered 2 years later, he experienced a minor stroke during a cabinet meeting. Suddenly, the US president found himself unable to move an arm and couldn't speak. He was urgently hospitalized and did everything necessary to recover. True to his style, he decided that this would not be the end of his political career. And years later, despite his fragile health, he won re-election. He governed until 1961, after which he retired from politics and focused on his private life. His death was a shock to the country because Dwight Eisenhower was not an ordinary president. We are talking about the man who led the Battle of Normandy and who challenged Adolf Hitler. Without him, the Allies' victory would not have been possible. Today we will tell you his story. Dwight Eisenhower was born in Denison, Texas, on October 14, 1890. Unlike other American politicians, he came from a working-class family. His father worked as a railroad mechanic and later as an employee in a dairy. He had his first encounter with tragedy as a child. His younger brother, Earl, suffered a terrible household accident. Dwight had left a knife on top of a cabinet, and he didn't see when his brother reached out to grab it, causing it to fall on his face. The child lost an eye forever, and the future president blamed himself for what had happened. Eisenhower's biographers claim that this was crucial for the deep sense of responsibility that would accompany him for the rest of his life. During this time, he also acquired a nickname that would stay with him throughout his life, Ike, intended as a diminutive of his last name. There are other specific events in his life that, in retrospect, are fundamental to understanding how he developed his personality. From a young age, he had an interest in reading, but not just any books, military history volumes. His mother was a very religious woman who was against war, although she couldn't instill that feeling in her son. Young Dwight felt destined to be a soldier and soon dismissed his mother's suggestion to join a Bible study group of Jehovah's Witnesses. As a teenager, Eisenhower experienced a medical problem that helped him forge the nerves of steel that would serve him well during the Normandy landing decades later. In 1909, at the age of 18, he suffered a knee injury that quickly became infected and spread along his leg to the groin. Doctors indicated that this could cost him his life, and the only way to save him was by amputating his leg. To everyone's surprise, Dwight vehemently opposed it. He preferred to risk death rather than lose a limb. His gamble turned out to be successful, as if by magic he healed. From then on, he decided to pursue his calling and headed to the United States Military Academy at West Point, the oldest and most prestigious military training institute in the United States. His performance as a student was not noteworthy, and he graduated in 1915 with the rank of second lieutenant. Let's hear from Captain Douglas Cone, a military historian, talking about this.
Dwight Eisenhower graduated from West Point in the class of 1915, the class the stars fell on because so many of its members became general officers in World War II.
Shortly afterward, Eisenhower married Mary Geneva Dude, nicknamed Mamie, with whom he would share the next 35 years of his life. With her, he had his first child, Icky, although the child died of scarlet fever in 1921 at the age of 3. Eisenhower chose never to speak of this tragic event, and although we can assume it was immense pain for him, we don't know what he was thinking at that time. As you can imagine, the period from 1914 to 1918 was crucial for many young American officers who, seeing how World War I unfolded, understood the destructive potential of such a large-scale conflict. Several of them even traveled and fought in Europe, but this was not the case for Eisenhower. Our protagonist remained in the United States, in the city of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he was assigned command of a tank training center. His mission was to instruct tank drivers and prepare them for what awaited them on the European battlefields. Although he received an award for fulfilling his duty perfectly, the conflict ended before he could engage in combat, which caused him great frustration. Later, during the Second World War, his political opponents would use his lack of wartime experience against him, arguing that such a man could not lead the U.S. Armed Forces. In the 1920s and 1930s, some say his career stalled, although he continued steadily, without surprises, slowly rising in military ranks. One of the most important events during this period occurred between 1935 and 1939, when he was appointed advisor to General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. At that time, this country was an informal colony of the United States. Our protagonist's task was to help the Filipino government organize its own army. The most challenging part of this mission was dealing with MacArthur, a man with a contentious personality, with whom he had frequent clashes. This experience, however, was useful for later learning to deal with similar men, such as Winston Churchill, George Patton, and Bernard Montgomery. Here you can see a curious snippet of a newsreel showing MacArthur sitting at his desk and assisted by Eisenhower.
The head of the Philippine forces as Field Marshal since 1937, General Douglas MacArthur was placed in command of the combined Philippine and U.S. forces in the Philippine Islands in July 1941.
When the Second World War broke out in Europe, Eisenhower returned to the United States. 2 years later, with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, he was appointed to the top brass of the American Armed Forces. From then on, he lived in Washington, where he was responsible for developing plans to confront the Japanese Empire and Germany. Suddenly, he became one of the most important men in the country. The lives of thousands and thousands of soldiers were in his hands, and his actions partly determined the success or failure of his nation. Remember that around this time, there was a belief that the Japanese would invade the west coast of the United States, so the pressure and stress on Eisenhower must have been enormous. In line with his new responsibilities, he was appointed Lieutenant General, one of the highest ranks in any army. Our protagonist not only rose through the ranks within the U.S. military, but also obtained a significant position in the high command of the Allies. From the beginning, his intention was to concentrate efforts on launching an invasion through the English Channel and occupying France with the goal of invading continental Europe and challenging the troops of the Third Reich. However, such an operation seemed impossible by the end of 1942, when Hitler remained strong, and the disasters of Operation Barbarossa had not yet reverberated. Therefore, Eisenhower's interest turned to North Africa, where he knew it would be easier to break the fascist dominance. The campaign was tough, as they had to face the prestigious German general Ernst Rommel, the desert fox famous for ambushing his enemies in the middle of sandstorms. Next, you can see some images of Eisenhower fraternizing with his troops and other allies in Africa. The African campaign concluded in 1943 with the Axis defeat, after which the invasion of Italy followed, culminating in the surrender of the fascist government. Now, finally, the situation was favorable for the long-awaited invasion of the English Channel. Eisenhower's plan revolved around an idea as simple as it was effective. If the Allies successfully coordinated their forces, they could land in France and destroy the German ground troops. Of course, the main challenge was to execute this maneuver successfully, as the Germans had filled the coast with obstacles. The most significant was the line of fortifications filled with machine guns, ready to mow down the Allies and drive them back into the sea. British and American High Command agreed to land in northwest France, in the Normandy region. Simultaneously, they launched an intense misinformation campaign so that the Germans would not know the exact date or location of the invasion. On June 6, 1944, Eisenhower inaugurated Operation Overlord. The fate of Europe and perhaps the world was at stake here. 5,000 ships sailed from the ports of Great Britain and crossed the English Channel bound for Normandy. On board were artillery pieces, provisions, tanks, resources, and thousands of nervous men who could either be heading to their graves or eternal glory. The crossing itself was tough, with the devastating cold leaving men soaked and shivering, many of them sick from nausea, vomiting repeatedly. However, it was the ideal moment to invade Europe and hasten the fall of the Third Reich. To prevent troops from deserting, the speech given by our protagonist before the battle, broadcast through loudspeakers, was crucial.
You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world.
If Eisenhower had postponed the operation, as many of his colleagues suggested, he would have had to wait another 2 weeks for the landing. This could have resulted in a catastrophe, as 2 weeks later, severe storms could have completely destroyed the Allied fleet. Only in the early morning did the troops see in the distance the beach of Normandy. As expected, the site was not abandoned. The Germans had prepared a deadly and lethal welcome. The coast was filled with metal obstacles heavy enough to halt tank advances. There were wooden stakes, barbed wire, and explosives hidden in the sand, forcing men to advance cautiously to avoid exploding into a festival of guts and bones. German soldiers waited crouched in their concrete bunkers, sheltered behind MG-42 machine guns, known as Hitler's saws due to the unpleasant sound they made when firing. When the Allied boats lowered their ramps and men descended into the water, the site turned into hell. The battle, especially on the infamous Omaha Beach, was far from adhering to Eisenhower's master plan. Like any confrontation, it turned into a struggle fought by desperate men whose sole objective was to survive, barely able to hear the orders their commanders shouted until they were hoarse. All that could be heard were deafening explosions, the endless gunfire, and the screams of the dying bleeding out on the sand. The coast was chaos. Everywhere one looked, there were corpses. They were on the ground, and in the sea the water had turned red. According to the protagonists themselves, the violence of the combat was unparalleled. The U.S. troops gave their best, and although on June 6, 1944, they did not manage to capture the entire coast, they did establish a crucial beachhead. This way, the Allies had a place to send reinforcements. In the following days, the position was secured, and they continued to advance across France. Despite the cost in lives, the Normandy landing had been a success, allowing the Third Reich to be cornered by its various enemies. At this point, the other commanders-in-chief had already handed over control of the Allied operations in Europe to Eisenhower. Similarly, the U.S. government rewarded him with the title of General of the Army, the second highest position in the institution. Finally, Germany surrendered in May 1945, and with that, Eisenhower's popularity soared to unexpected levels. It seemed that our protagonist had reached the pinnacle of his career, but something better awaited him. In the 1948 presidential elections, many speculated about the possibility of the general running for president. However, this did not happen, as he preferred to stay away from politics, claiming that his life was that of a soldier. On that occasion, the winner was Harry S. Truman, although Ike would have his rematch shortly after in 1952. This year, he felt that the conditions were right to run for and win the elections. This is exactly what happened, and that's how Dwight Eisenhower became the President of the United States and governed until 1961. Here we can see a segment from an English news report announcing the news.
The famous commander of armies, who later presided over Columbia University, now assumes the leadership of the United States of America. We knew him well in Britain during World War II and after victory had been won, and Britain followed his dramatic defeat of Mr. Taft and his nomination as Republican presidential candidate.
At the end of his term, he did not completely retire from politics and continued to support Republican Party candidates to which he belonged. As we told you at the beginning of this video, he died on March 28, 1969, from a heart failure. Today, Eisenhower is remembered as one of the most important figures of the 20th century, a man without whom victory over the Axis would have been impossible. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what is your opinion of Dwight Eisenhower? How important do you think he was in the Allied victory? Leave your response in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.